Hello. Normally, I put the ad reads at the back end of the podcast so that you can hear the good stuff and not have to listen to me shill pointlessly for 2 minutes. And just so you know, I do this intentionally in our production because even I object to commercials as much as the next podcast listener. However, at this moment, I would ask that you indulge me because I've got a book coming out on April 30th, 2022 on Amazon, and I'd like you to go ahead and place your order right now. The book's title is 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation for Intentional Leadership, and it's a collection of 13 essays on leadership. In the book, I address the 12 leadership areas that we have found leaders need to be the most effective in, and then I throw in an extra essay there at the back end. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it, I believe can help you become a better leader. This book wasn't written just over the course of the last 2 years, and this isn't another fly-by-night leadership development book, here today and gone in the wind in the next month. 12 Rules for Leaders represents a continuation of the work we've been doing here at HSCT Publishing with our leadership training and development products and services, from Leadership Toolbox to Leading Keys, and it also represents the distillation of lessons we've learned, absorbed, and transmitted to others from training and developing around 15,000 managers and supervisors over the course of the last 10 years. This is no slouch of a book, but it's written in an easy-to-understand and easy-to-read direct format with practical tips that you can implement today, no matter your leadership problem, your leadership situation, or your leadership circumstances. It's kind of like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. I fundamentally believe that this is the book right now, for right now, because leaders like you are positioned to do great work during the truly revolutionary times we are living in, well, right now. And sometimes you need a book as a guide to help you through the work. So head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us and scroll down the homepage. Click on the link and add your name to the pre-order list for 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation for Intentional Leadership. And look for the book in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon on April 30th, 2022. By the way, we'll be talking about the rules in 12 Rules for Leaders in our podcasts, both the long and the short, throughout the months of May and June, so you don't want to miss out on that. And well, that was 3 minutes. So that's it for me. Out. My name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 17. With our book today, and our author, Joan Didion. From Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion. Slouching Towards Bethlehem is also the title of one piece in the book, and that piece, which derived from some time spent in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, was for me both the most imperative of all these pieces to write, and the only one that made me despondent after it was printed. It was the first time I had dealt directly and flatly with the evidence of atomization, the proof that things fall apart. I went to San Francisco because I had not been able to work in some months, had been paralyzed by the conviction that writing was an irrelevant act, that the world, as I had understood it, no longer existed. I suppose almost everyone who writes is afflicted some of the time by the suspicion that nobody out there is listening, but it seemed to me then, perhaps because the piece was important to me, that I had never gotten a feedback so universally beside the point. I was, in fact, as sick as I had ever been when I was writing Slouching Towards Bethlehem. The pain kept me awake at night, and so for 20 and 21 hours a day, I drank gin and hot water to blunt the pain and took dexedrine to blunt the gin and wrote the piece. I would like you to believe that I kept working out of some real professionalism to meet the deadline, but that would not be entirely true. I did have a deadline, but it was also a troubled time, and working did to the trouble what gin did to the pain. And what else is there to tell? I am bad at interviewing people. I avoid situations in which I have to talk to anyone's press agent. This precludes me doing pieces on most actors, a bonus in itself. I do not like to make telephone calls and would not like to count the mornings I have sat on some Best Western motel bed somewhere and tried to force myself to put through the call to the assistant district attorney. My only advantage as a reporter is that I am so physically small, so temperamentally unobtrusive, and so neurotically inarticulate that people tend to forget that my presence runs counter to their best interests. And it always does. That is one last thing to remember. Writers are always selling someone out. Her writing defied everyone, political leftists and political rightists alike. Now, I am not known for trending towards liking writers of outsiders and writers about outsiders or the gonzo journalist types, right? But there is a type of writer whose work is on the spectrum of what used to be called gonzo. This writer observes what is happening and then seeks to write about the happenings they have observed in such a way as their values never leak into the document. You're never quite sure what side they're on or who, as Joan just wrote, they're selling out. You have to infer between the lines. We live now in the 21st century in a world of obviousness, right? Because our media is opinionated and everybody is seeking to make their opinion, their feelings, such as it were, the height of everything from government policy to how you personally react to their feelings. And our positions have become hardwired. And our time is short because social media has warped us into believing that the 7-second hot take or the 244-word tweet is the highest of intellectual honesty. One woman who saw all this coming, and you can assert that maybe all of these things have always existed, and maybe they always have, but the one woman who saw all of this coming was Joan Didion. By the way, I say the late, great Joan Didion. She was born on December 5th, 1934 in Sacramento, California, and was part of the strangeness of the last state of the continental West in the great USA until she did what every person in LA really desires to do in their heart. She went east. She self-identified as a quote-unquote shy, bookish child who pushed herself to overcome social anxiety through acting and public speaking. And she was also an avid reader. As a matter of fact, she spent her adolescence typing out Ernest Hemingway's works, which we're going to read later on this month on our podcast, to learn more about how sentence structures actually work. Didion received a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from the University of California, Berkeley in 1956, and during her senior year, she won first prize in an essay contest and went to work for the magazine Vogue for 7 years in New York, working her way up from promotional copywriter to associate feature editor. By the time she was done cutting her eye teeth by developing the hard skills of writing, interviewing, and internalizing hard truths about the way she felt about the way the world was supposed to work, She went back to California. She journeyed back west just in time to document and report on the endless, drowning wave of coming weirdness. Weirdness approaching from the edges, as Gandalf would intone many years later in the film Lord of the Rings, out of the West. Today, on our podcast, the late, great Joan Didion. In the summer of 1943, I was 8, and my father and mother and small brother and I were at Peterson Field in Colorado Springs. By the way, we're back to Joan Didion. We are reading John Wayne, A Love Song. A hot wind blew through that summer, blew until it seemed that before August broke, all the dust in Kansas would be in Colorado and would have drifted over the tar paper barracks and the temporary strip and stopped only when it hit Pikes Peak. There was not much to do a summer like that. There was the day they brought in the first B-29, an event to remember but scarcely a vacation program. There was an officers' club and no swimming pool. All the officers' club had of interest was artificial blue rain behind the bar. The rain interested me a good deal, but I could not spend the summer watching it, and so we went, my brother and I, to the movies. We went. And then she talks about going to the movies to see John Wayne. I'm going to skip through some of this. She says, as it happened, I did not grow up to be the kind of woman who is the heroine in a Western, although the men I have known have had many of the virtues and have taken me to live in many places I have come to love, they have never been John Wayne. And they have never taken me to that bend in the river where the cottonwoods grow. Deep in that part of my heart where the artificial rain forever falls, that is still the line I wait to hear. I tell you this neither in a spirit of self-revelation nor as an exercise in total recall, but simply to demonstrate that when John Wayne rode through my childhood and perhaps through yours, he determined forever the shape of a certain of our dreams. It did not seem possible that such a man could fall ill, could carry with him that most inexplicable and ungovernable of diseases. The rumor struck some obscure anxiety through our very childhood into question. In John Wayne's world, John Wayne was supposed to give orders. Let's ride, he said, and saddle up. Forward ho, and a man's got to do what a man's got to do. Hello there, he said when he first saw a girl in a construction camp or on a train or just standing around on the front porch waiting for somebody to ride up through the tall grass. When John Wayne spoke, there was no mistaking his intentions. He had a sexual authority so strong that even a child could perceive it. And in a world where we understood early to be characterized by venality and doubt and paralyzing ambiguities, he suggested another world, one which may or may not have existed, but in any case existed no more. A place where a man could move free, could make his own code and live by it. A world in which if a man did what he had to do, he could one day take the girl and go riding through the draw and find himself home free. Not in a hospital with something going wrong inside, not on a high bed with the flowers and the drugs and the forced smiles, but there at the bend in the bright river, the cottonwoods shimmering in the early morning sun. Born Marion Morrison in Winterset, Iowa. By the way, just a side note here as I pause, I've actually been to Winterset, Iowa, and it does say the home of John Wayne. By the way, there's a sign there. It's an interesting thing to go see if you ever have the opportunity to drive across America and check that out. The son of a druggist was John Wayne. Moved as a child to Lancaster, California, back to the book, part of the migration to that promised land sometimes called the West Coast of Iowa. Imagine Marion Morrison in Glendale, a Boy Scout, then a student at Glendale High, a tackle for USC, a Sigma Chi. Summer vacations, a job moving props on the old Fox lot. There, a meeting with John Ford, one of the several directors who were to sense that into this perfect mold might be poured the inarticulate longings of a nation wondering at just what pass the trail had been lost. "Damn it," said Raoul Walsh later on. "The son of a bitch looked like a man." And so after a while, the boy from Glendale became a star. He did not become an actor, as he has always been careful to point out in interviews. "How many times do I gotta tell you? I don't act at all. I react." But a star. And the star called John Wayne would spend most of the rest of his life with one or another of those directors, out on some forsaken location, in search of the dream. Didion wrote from her own personal experiences, and this is something that leaders need to pay attention to in this podcast. We're going to talk today a little bit about self-awareness. We're going to talk about reflection and journaling and how do leaders gain and assert self-awareness. And the nonfiction, essay-driven personal memoir, what we used to call personal memoir anyway, now today we call blogging or podcasting or anything else that's personal, or at least seems that way, is a method for leaders to grow in self-awareness. And Didion used the personal essay to talk about not only what was going on with her, but how she perceived what was going on with America. Now, she's viewed through that lens incredibly critically, the second lens, the what's going on with America lens. But we're going to view her through that first lens today because she's rarely looked at that way. And a memoirist like a Hemingway or a Didion or a Kerouac or even a John Steinbeck, again, all of whom we will cover on the podcast this month, these types of individuals are putting out, yes, their personal story to say something about the thing they are observing, but subtly at a very lower level, they are saying something about themselves. And leaders have to be tied into their own self-awareness. I'm going to read to you from the Wikipedia article about Joan Didion right now. It says, she wrote from her own personal perspective, adding her own feelings and memories to situations, inventing details and quotes to make the stories more vivid, and using many metaphors in order for the reader to get a better understanding of the disorder present in the subjects of her essays, whether they be politicians, artists, or American society itself. That's actually a pretty good description of exactly what Joan Didion did through her literary life. Are you going to actually know Joan Didion, the woman? Probably not. Actually, definitely not. Looking back many years later, in 2011, she had noted in an interview, quote, "I thought that it was important always for the reader, for me to place myself in the piece, so that the reader knew where I was, the reader knew who was talking. At the time I started doing these pieces, it was not considered a good thing for writers to put themselves front and center, but I had this strong feeling you had to place yourself there and tell the reader who that was at the other end of the voice." Now, it's a thin line, by the way, unquote. It's a thin line between placing yourself at the center and telling us your opinions. And Didion walked that fine line in a number of her books, a number of her essays, and you can grab any of these collections, and we would recommend all of them, from the White Album, in her fiction anyway, all the way to Play It As It Lays, and then The Year of Magical Thinking and Blue Nights. When leaders think about self-awareness, leaders have to think about a number of different factors in here. The big ones are reflection and journaling, insight and self-deception. And leaders might do really well to start today, if you're within the sound of my voice, at keeping a notebook. Back to Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion. We'll now read from her essay on keeping a notebook. Why did I write it down? In order to remember, of course, but exactly what was it I wanted to remember? How much of it actually happened? Did any of it? Why do I keep a notebook at all? It is easy to deceive oneself on all those scores. The impulse to write things down is a peculiarly compulsive one, inexplicable to those who do not share it, useful only accidentally, only secondarily, in the way that any compulsion tries to justify itself. I suppose that it begins or does not begin in the cradle. Although I have felt compelled to write things down since I was 5 years old, I doubt that my daughter ever will, for she is singularly blessed and accepting child, delighted with life exactly as life presents itself to her, unafraid to go to sleep and unafraid to wake up. Keepers of private notebooks are a different breed altogether, lonely and resistant rearrangers of things, anxious malcontents, children afflicted, apparently at birth, with some presentiment of loss. My first notebook was a Big 5 tablet given to me by my mother, with the sensible suggestion that I stop whining and learn to amuse myself by writing down my thoughts. She returned the tablet to me a few years ago. The first entry is the account of a woman who believed herself to be freezing to death in the Arctic night, only to find, when day broke, that she had stumbled onto the Sahara Desert, where she would die of heat before lunch. I have no idea what turn of a 5-year-old's mind could have prompted so insistently ironic and exotic a story, but it does reveal a certain predilection for the extreme which has dogged me into adult life. Perhaps if I were analytically inclined, I would find it a truer story than any I might have told about Donald Johnson's birthday party, or the day my cousin Brenda put kitty litter in the aquarium. So the point of keeping a notebook has never been, nor is it now, to have an accurate factual record of what I have been doing or thinking. That would be a different impulse entirely, an instinct for reality which I sometimes envy but do not possess. At no point have I ever been able to successfully keep a diary. My approach to daily life ranges from the grossly negligent to the merely absent, and on those few occasions when I have tried dutifully to record the day's events, boredom has so overcome me that the results are mysterious at best. What is this business about shopping, typing, peace dinner with E depressed? Shopping for what? Typing what piece? Who is E? Was this E depressed, or was I depressed? Who cares? In fact, I have abandoned altogether that kind of pointless entry. Instead, I tell what some would call lies. That's simply not true. The members of my family frequently tell me when they come up against my memory of a shared event. The party was not for you. The spider was not a black widow. It wasn't that way at all. Very likely they are right, for not only have I always had trouble distinguishing between what happened and what merely might have happened, but I remain unconvinced that the distinction, for my purposes, matters. How it felt to me, that is getting closer to the truth about a notebook. I sometimes delude myself about why I keep a notebook. Imagine that some thrifty virtue derives from preserving everything observed. See enough and write it down, I tell myself, and then some morning when the world seems drained of wonder, someday when I am only going through the motions of doing what I am supposed to do, which is right, on that bankrupt morning I will simply open my notebook and there it will all be. A forgotten account with accumulated interest, paid passage back to the world out there, dialogue overheard in hotels and elevators, and at the hat check counter in pavilion. One middle-aged man shows his hat check to another and says, "That's my old football number." Impressions of Bettina Aptheker and Benjamin Sonnenberg and Teddy Mr. Acapulco Stauffer. Careful apropos about tennis bums and failed fashion models and Greek shipping heiresses, one of whom taught me a significant lesson. A lesson I could have learned from F. Scott Fitzgerald, but perhaps we must all meet the very rich for ourselves. By asking, when I arrived to interview her in her orchid-filled sitting room on the second day of a paralyzing New York blizzard, whether it was snowing outside. The most important trait that leaders must develop walks alongside, or slouches, depending upon your perspective, the skill set of clarity. And that important trait is, of course, the trait that she's talking about in that section from On Keeping a Notebook. It is self-awareness. Sure, leaders must know what is going on outside of themselves, but if they have little idea or interest in what is going on within their emotions, inside themselves, their motives, their needs, their passions, and even their own resistance or disinterest and boredom, then all the focus on the outside makes little sense, and it makes their acts of leadership those of dead men, whitewashing tombs. But so many leaders underestimate this truth. They ignore it, or they have to be rudely reminded that the inner life is just as important, if not more so, than the outer life. You know, the one they get claps for, and the ones that books are written about. The memoir, the essay, the nonfiction journal that documents a life in leadership can help a leader grow in self-awareness. But also, more importantly, it can help a leader avoid the personal emotional selling out. Because remember, the writer is always selling somebody out. That self-deception and being self-deceived entails. Back to On Keeping a Notebook by Joan Didion from her collection of essays, Slouching Towards Bethlehem. We are brought up in the ethic that others, any others, all others, are by definition more interesting than ourselves. Taught to be diffident, just this side of self-effacing. Quote, "You're the least important person in this room, don't forget it," unquote. Jessica Mitford's governess would hiss in her ear on the advent of any social occasion. I copied that into my notebook because it is only recently that I've been able to enter a room without hearing some such phrase in my inner ear. Only the very young and the very old may recount their dreams at breakfast, dwell upon self, interrupt with memories of beach picnics and favorite Liberty lawn dresses, and the rainbow trout in a creek near Colorado Springs. The rest of us are expected, rightly, to affect absorption in other people's favorite dresses, other people's trout. And so we do. But our notebooks give us a way, for however dutifully we record what we see around us, the common denominator of all we see is always transparently, shamelessly the implacable eye. We are not talking here about the kind of notebook that is patently for public consumption, a structural conceit for binding together a series of graceful pensées. We are talking about something private, about bits of the mind string too short to use, an indiscriminate and erratic assemblage with meaning only for its maker. And sometimes the maker has difficulty with the meaning. Perhaps it is difficult to see the value in having oneself back in that kind of a mood. Skipping ahead a little bit, she's talking about living on $650 a month, thinking about Jimmy Hoffa, what kind of person would hold a notebook. And then she begins to wrap up with this. Perhaps it's difficult to see the value in having oneself back in that kind of mood, but I do see it. I think we are well advised to keep on nodding terms with the people we used to be, whether we find them attractive company or not. Otherwise, they turn up unannounced and surprise us, come hammering on the mind's door at 4 a.m. of a bad night and demand to know who deserted them, who betrayed them, who is going to make amends. We forget all too soon the things we thought we could never forget. We forget the loves and the betrayals alike, forget what we whispered and what we screamed, forget who we were. I have already lost touch with a couple of people I used to be. One of them, a 17-year-old, presents little threat, although it would be of some interest to me to know again what it feels like to sit on a river levee, drinking vodka and orange juice, and listening to Les Paul and Mary Ford, and their echoes sing How High the Moon on the car radio. You see, I still have the scenes, but I no longer perceive myself among those present, no longer could even improvise the dialogue. The other one, a 23-year-old, bothers me more. She was always a good deal of trouble, and I suspect she will reappear when I least want to see her. Skirts too long, shy to the point of aggravation, always the injured party, full of recriminations and little hurts and stories I do not want to hear again, at once saddening me and angering me with her vulnerability and ignorance, an apparition all the more insistent for being so long banished. Leaders keep notebooks, right? They keep, You can call it a diary, you can call it a journal, you can call it a blog, but at the end of the day, there's only two ways, and Didion hits on this on Keeping a Notebook in Slouching Towards Bethlehem. There's only two ways to grow in self-awareness for a leader. That's reflection and writing. That's it. Tragically, however, many leaders, positional, situational, and otherwise, fail to take the time to engage with self-awareness work because it's hard, and it requires quiet introspection, and it requires time. And in a world that crowds in with the cell phones and the bleeping and the blopping, that crowds in with family and external obligations, that crowds in with entertainment and laziness and other options and choices for distractions, leaders fail sometimes to set the boundaries that are necessary so that they have the time to engage in introspection, to put down the cell phone and to quiet the biggest noise of all, their internal self-dialogue. This is the element of self-awareness growth that's rarely talked about, but it is important to note. Many leaders believe one of two lies, or they believe both of them at the same time in a mix and in a mingle, but they are two lies that leaders believe about self-awareness. And these are actually counterpoints to each other. By the way, leaders, just like anybody else, can hold two contradicting points in their head at the same time. The first lie that leaders have in their heads is that self-awareness work is merely a navel-gazing, selfish activity that can't possibly bring leadership dividends. The second lie is that they don't need to do the work of developing self-awareness because, well, they are self-aware of their emotions anyway. Leaders must realize that believing these two lies in whatever concoction or brew is in their head can lead them to being self-deceived. Being self-deceived by their own victories and losses, being self-deceived by their own biases, their own prejudices, their own judgments. They must also realize that every time they write in a journal, a blog, or a diary, they are engaged practically in the activity of selling someone out. And the person they're usually selling out is themselves. Now I'd like to take a turn here and talk about the documenting of spiritual drift in real time. I'd like to read directly from The Second Coming, from which Slouching Towards Bethlehem gets its title, by the poet W.B. Yeats, writing after World War II. Turning on the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with a lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. From Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion, the essay that gives the book its title, Slouching Towards Bethlehem. The center was not holding. It was a country of bankruptcy notices and public auction announcements and commonplace reports of casual killings. and misplaced children in abandoned homes and vandals who misspelled even the four-letter words they scrawled. It was a country in which families routinely disappeared, trailing bad checks and repossession papers. Adolescents drifted from city to torn city, sloughing off both the past and the future as snakes shed their skins. Children who were never taught and would never now learn the games that had held society together. People were missing, children were missing, parents were missing. Those left behind filed desultory missing persons reports, then moved on themselves. It was not a country in open revolution. It was not a country under enemy siege. It was the United States of America in the cold late spring of 1967, and the market was steady and the GNP high, and a great many articulate people seemed to have a sense of high social purpose, and it might have been a spring of brave hopes and national promise, but it was not, and more people had the uneasy apprehension that it was not. All that seemed clear was that at some point we had aborted ourselves and butchered the job, and because nothing else seemed so relevant, I decided to go to San Francisco. As you read through the essay, Didion begins to document what she saw in San Francisco, from people named Deadeye and Chula Vista and Maria and Don and Max, all the way to the individuals who are shooting up heroin underneath posters of Allen Ginsberg and hanging out in their pajamas with instant coffee. And of course, the ever persistent acid dropping. LSD use was quite a thing in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury district in 1967. She documented the stories of individuals who had run away from the center. They had come there to the edge of, as I opened up earlier, the edge of the weirdness. And she was documenting what Ezekiel 7:6 talks about. She was documenting spiritual drift in real time. She was documenting the beginning of where we have all wound up at the clearing, at the end of the path that began there. Back to the book, I hear quite a bit about one cop, Officer Arthur Jesan, whose name has become a synonym for zealotry on the street. By the way, the street is what they refer to Haight-Ashbury as. He's our Officer Krupke, Max once told me. Max is not personally wild about Officer Gerards because Officer Gerards took Max in after the Human Bee Inn last winter. That's the big Human Bee Inn in Golden Gate Park where 20,000 people got turned on for free, or 10,000 did, or some number did, but then Officer Jesan has busted almost everyone in the district at one time or another. By the way, getting turned on is going out doing LSD in public and then dancing around. By the way, not a lot has changed in San Francisco. If you go there to Golden Gate Park, you'll see some of that exact same behavior today. Presumably, to forestall a cult of personality, Officer Jesan was transferred out of the district not long ago, and when I see him, he is not at the Park Station, but at the Central Station on Greenwich Avenue. We are in an interrogation room, and I am interrogating Officer Jesan. He is young and blonde and wary, and I go in slow. I wonder what he thinks the quote-unquote major problems are in the hate. Officer Jesan thinks it over. I would say the major problems there, he says finally, the major problems are narcotics and juveniles. Juveniles and narcotics, those are your major problems. I write that down. Just one moment, Officer Jesan says and leaves the room. When he comes back, he tells me I cannot talk to him without permission from Chief Thomas Cahill. In the meantime, Officer Jesan adds, pointing to the notebook in which I have written major problems, juveniles, narcotics. I'll take those notes. The next day, I apply for permission to talk to Officer Jesan and also to Chief Cahill. A few days later, Sergeant returns my call. We have finally received clearance from the chief per your request, the sergeant said, and that is taboo. I wonder why it is taboo to talk to Officer Jesan. Officer Jesan is involved in court cases coming to trial. I wonder why it is taboo to talk to Chief Cahill. The chief has pressing police business. I wonder if I can talk to anyone at all in the police department. No, the sergeant says, not at the particular moment, which was my last official contact with the San Francisco police department. She continues to write in Slouching Towards Bethlehem, tells the story of a gentleman named Max and how Max and Sharon are living together with another couple named Tom and Barbara. And they are on acid. They are doing hash. And there may or may not be a child involved in that situation. Then she tells a story about a gentleman named Arthur Leash, and his leadership. Speaking of leadership in the hate, his leadership of a group of anonymous good guys with no thought in their collective head but to lend a helping hand called the Diggers. And then she talks about the legacy of the Beat generation, and we're going to talk about Kerouac on this show later on at the end of the month. But the guys who hung out with Kerouac, Ginsberg and Burroughs, they were the precursors to what we think of as the 60s hippies, which is what I'm describing here, or the baby boomer hippies. And by the way, just want to point this out, and I've said it several times in different contexts, the exact same behavior that the baby boomers who are in their 70s now dislike in the younger generation at scale, they started at the beginning in the 60s. Back to Slouching Towards Bethlehem. Chester Anderson is a legacy of the Beat generation. A man in his middle 30s, just think about that for a minute, whose peculiar hold on the district derives from his possession of a mimeograph machine on which he prints communiques signed the Communication Company. It is another tenet of the official district mythology that the Communication Company will print anything anybody has to say, but in fact, Chester Anderson prints only what he writes himself, agrees with, or considers harmless or dead matter. Mimeographs machines were earlier versions of blogs. His statements, which are left in piles and pasted on windows around Haight Street, are regarded with some apprehension in the district and with considerable interest by outsiders who study them, like China watchers for subtle shifts in obscure ideologies. An Anderson communique might be doing something as specific as fingering someone who is said to have set up a marijuana bust, or it might be working in a more general vein. Quoting from one of these mimeographed communiques from the Communication Company, pretty little 16-year-old middle-class chick comes to the Haight to see what it's all about and gets picked up by a 17-year-old street dealer who spends all day shooting her full of speed again and again, then feeds her 3,000 mics and raffles off her temporarily unemployed body for the biggest Haight Street gangbang since the night before last. The politics and ethics of ecstasy. Rape is as common as bullshit on Haight Street. Kids are starving on the street. Minds and bodies are being maimed as we watch a scale model of Vietnam. Somebody other than Jane Lish gave me an address for Chester Anderson, 443 Arguello, but 443 Arguello does not exist. I telephoned the wife of the man who gave me 443 Arguello, and she says it's 742 Arguello. But don't go up there, she says. I say I'll telephone. There's no number, she says. I can't give it to you. 742 Arguello, I say. No, she says, I don't know, and don't go there, and don't use either my name or my husband's name if you do. She is the wife of a full professor of English at San Francisco State College. I decide to lie low on the question of Chester Anderson for a while. A little bit later on in the book, in the essay, there are only 3 significant pieces of data in the world today, is another thing Chet Helms told me one night. We were at the Avalon, and the big strobe was going, and the colored lights and the Dayglow painting, and the place was full of high school kids trying to look turned on. The Avalon sound system projects 126 decibels at 100 feet, but to Chet Helms, the sound is just there like the air, and he talks through it. The first is, he said, God died last year and was obitted by the press. The second is 50% of the population is or will be under 25. A boy shook a tambourine toward us, and Chet smiled benevolently at him. The third, he said, is that they got $20 billion irresponsible dollars to spend. Moving a little further down the road, we meet a gentleman named Deadeye, and Deadeye's old lady, a woman named Jerry. Deadeye's old lady, Jerry, meets us at the door of their place. She's a big, hardy girl who was always counseled at Girl Scout camps during summer vacations and was in social welfare at the University of Washington, where she decided that she just hadn't done enough living and came to San Francisco. Actually, the heat was bad in Seattle, she adds. The first night I got down here, she says, I stayed with a gal I met over at the Blue Unicorn. I looked like I just arrived, had a knapsack and stuff. After that, Jerry stayed at a house the Diggers were running where she met Deadeye. Then it took me time to get my bearings, so I haven't done much work yet. I asked Jerry what work she does. Basically, I'm a poet, she says, but I had my guitar stolen right after I arrived, and that kind of hung up my thing. Get your books, Deadeye orders. Show her your books. Jerry demurs, then goes into the bedroom and comes back with several theme books full of verse. I leaf through them, but Deadeye is still talking about helping people. Any kid that's on speed, he says, I try to get him off it. The only advantage to it from the kid's point of view is that you don't have to worry about sleeping or eating. Or sex, Jerry adds. That's right, when you're strung out on crystal, you don't need nothing. It can lead to the hard stuff, Jerry says. Take your average meth freak. Once he started putting the needle in his arm, it's not too hard to say, well, let's shoot a little smack. All the while I'm looking at Jerry's poems. They are a very young girl's poems, each written out in a neat hand and finished off with a curly Q. Dawns are roseate, skies silver-tinted. When Jerry writes crystal in her books, she does not mean meth. You got to get back to your writing, Deadeye says fondly, but Jerry ignores this. She's telling about somebody who propositioned her yesterday. He just walked up to me on the street, offered me $600 to go to Reno and do the thing. You're not the only one he approached, Deadeye says. If some chick wants to go with him, fine, Jerry says. Just don't bum my trip. She empties the tuna fish can we are using for an ashtray and goes over to look at a girl who is asleep on the floor. It is the same girl who was sleeping on the floor the first day I came to Deadeye's place. She has been sick a week now, 10 days. Usually, when someone comes up to me on the street like that, Jerry adds, I hit him for some change. In the late 20th century, this is something I'm obsessed with personally, both as a reader of literature and as an amateur historian and as a person who just observes, things and understands human nature. In the late 20th century, something happened right after World War II, and I'm firmly convinced that war, that apocalyptic struggle against venal evil, really took something out of America. It unlocked doors. It opened up spiritual and moral and psychological processes that we hadn't yet figured out how to deal with. However, I'm going to make a bigger point here. The fundamentals that the country had been built on for the first 160 some odd years of its existence, or 170, depending upon your tracking up to that point, had been and were and continue to be strong, the fundamental pillars. And the pillars are, of course, the creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's the creed. Religion, a full-throated, robust public Christianity, whether or not anybody 100% agreed with it was an irrelevancy. That was the second pillar. And the third pillar was this idea that the center was holding. And in 1960, 7 years before Didion wrote this essay, 7 years before the weirdness of the West began to culturally fray and move acidically towards the center, which is where it's at now, and eating the pillars as we speak. During that time in the early 60s, there was a sense of hope. Actually, there was a mountain of hope. This is where leaders really need to pay attention. And this mountain of hope was the mountain that John F. Kennedy was talking about climbing triumphantly in his first inaugural address. And it was the mountain that Americans at the edges of the culture, in places like San Francisco and New York and Miami and Chicago, at the edges of the culture, were desperate for a leader to help them climb. And when the president was killed in Dealey Plaza in Dallas in 1963, the dream of an attainable ideal died with him, and then the country went fully off the rails. And I firmly believe that the country, with the exceptions of a few moments maybe in the 80s and in the 90s, pretty much has sustained shocks since September 11th all the way to now, which are rocking us to our very foundations. And when a thing is being eaten by acid and then is rocked to its foundations, well, then there you go. But where was the center of the country? Where was it physically located? Where was the geography? Where was the place? Well, the geography and the place, the center of the country, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. The center of the country was not in San Francisco. The center of the country has never been on the coasts, right? The center of the country is located in small towns and in backwater counties. And that's where those fundamentals existed. Now, Didion did not report on those places. Instead, she reported on the fraying edges. I believe that she was attempting to do this reportage, such as it were, to borrow a term from the description of Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Ernest Hemingway. She was doing this reportage to wake up the slumbering center to the approaching acidity of moral weakness that was slowly creeping its way in from the edges. She was trying to shake the center out of its slumber. Unfortunately, very few people at the time read Vogue or Mademoiselle, at least very few people in those backwater counties and in those small towns. And most of the high cultural tastemakers at the time, and she even calls them out at the beginning of her essay, they were really focused on buttressing up the center rather than going to the edges and attempting to deal with that. They didn't deal with the rot at the place where they needed to go deal with it. Instead, they focused on shoring up the center. And the center didn't wake up to the cultural rot until the 1980s. That's when Ronald Reagan got elected. And she has some things to say in her collection of essays called After Henry, because she politically disagreed with Ronald Reagan. But by that point, the boat was already setting sail, or the horse was already out of the barn, or however you want to frame it. And the cracks were already starting to show in the walls of the edifice. However, it would take another 30 years for the hope to go completely out of American culture, and that's where we live right now. This is why I keep saying on this podcast that the people who are going to lead us out of this cultural rot are going to be the innocuous small people. It's going to be the hobbits. It's not going to be the presidents. Kennedy, Reagan, Trump, Obama, Clinton, either one of them. It doesn't matter who you pick. It doesn't matter who the ideal is. What matters is that the ideal is in you. And now we have to journey to our own centers. We have to journey to our own selves, and we have to get self-aware about that journey in order to know what to do to fix the things that are happening in our body politic today. The big lesson from this section of Slouching towards Bethlehem is not that we need to focus on race or culture or gender or class distinctions or any of that other garbage. All of those things, quite frankly, may be interesting to talk about, but at the end of the day, they're distractions. The thing that leaders need to focus on in their work, in their families, and in their communities is making sure that they are aware of what is happening at the edges and that they are paying hyper close attention to that while also shoring up the center. Otherwise, Yeats is correct. The center won't hold. And we will see a rough beast that will be slouching towards our own personal Bethlehems. So, back to the Didion as we close with Slouching Towards Bethlehem. We'll read from her final essay, Goodbye to All That. It is easy to see the beginnings of things and harder to see the ends. I can remember now with a clarity that makes the nerves in the back of my neck constrict when New York began for me, but I cannot lay my finger upon the moment it ended. Can never cut through the ambiguities and second starts and broken resolves to the exact place on the page where the heroine is no longer as optimistic as she once was. When I first saw New York, I was 20, and it was summertime. I got off at DC-7 at the old Idlewild Temporary Terminal in a new dress, which had seemed very smart in Sacramento, but seemed less smart already, even in the old Idlewild Temporary Terminal, and the warm air smelled of mildew and some instinct programmed by all the movies I had ever seen and all the songs I'd ever heard sung and all the stories I'd ever had read about New York informed me that it would never be quite the same again. That first night, I opened my window on the bus into town and watched for the skyline, but all I could see were the wastes of Queens and the big signs that said Midtown Tunnel this lane, and then a flood of summer rain. Even that seemed remarkable and exotic, for I had come out of the West where there was no summer rain. And for the next 3 days, I sat wrapped in blankets in a hotel room, air-conditioned to 35 degrees, and tried to get over a bad cold and a high fever. It did not occur to me to call a doctor because I knew none, and although it did occur to me to call the desk and ask if the air conditioner be turned off, I never called because I did not know how much to tip whoever might come. Was anyone ever so young? I'm here to tell you that someone was. All I could do during those 3 days was talk long distance to the boy I already knew I would never marry in the spring. I would stay in New York, I told him, just 6 months. And I could see the Brooklyn Bridge from my window. As it turned out, the bridge was the Triborough, and I stayed 8 years. Part of what I want to tell you is what it is like to be young in New York, how 6 months can become 8 years with the deceptive ease of a film dissolve. For that is how those years appear to me now, in a long sequence of sentimental dissolves and old-fashioned trick shots. The Seagram Building foundations dissolve into snowflakes. I enter a revolving door at 20 and come out a good deal older and on a different street. But most particularly, I want to explain to you, and in the process perhaps to myself, why I no longer live in New York. It is often said that New York is a city for only the very rich and the very poor. It is left often said that New York is also, at least for those of us who came here from somewhere else, a city for only the very young. It would be a long while because, quite simply, I was in love with New York. I do not mean love in any colloquial way. I mean I was in love with the city, the way you love the first person who ever touches you and never love anyone quite that way again. I remember walking across 62nd Street one twilight that first spring, or the second spring. They were all alike for a while. I was late to meet someone, but I stopped at Lexington Avenue and bought a peach and stood on the corner eating it and knew that I had come out of the West and reached the mirage. I could taste the peach and feel the soft air blowing from a subway grating on my legs, and I could smell the lilac and garbage and expensive perfume, and I knew that it would cost something sooner or later because I did not belong there, did not come from there. But when you are 22 or 23, you figure that later you'll have a high emotional balance and be able to pay whatever it costs. I still believed in possibilities then, still had the sense, so peculiar to New York, that something extraordinary could happen at any minute, any day, any month. I was making only $65 or $70 a week then. Put yourself in Hetty Carnegie's hands, I was advised without the slightest trace of irony by an editor of the magazine for which I worked. So little money that some weeks I had to charge food at Bloomingdale's gourmet shop in order to eat, a fact which went unmentioned in the letters I wrote to California. I never told my father that I needed money because he would have sent it, and I would never know if I could do it by myself. At that time, making a living seemed a game to me with arbitrary but quite inflexible rules. And except on a certain kind of winter evening, 6:30 in the 70s, say already dark and bitter with the wind off the river, when I would be walking very fast toward a bus and would look in the bright windows of brownstones and see cooks working in clean kitchens and imagine women lighting candles on the floor above and beautiful children being bathed on the floor above that, except on nights like those, I never felt poor. I had the feeling that if I needed money, I could always get it. I could write a syndicated column for teenagers under the name Debbie Lynn, or I could smuggle gold into India, or I could become a $100 call girl, and none of it would matter. You see, I was in a curious position in New York. It never occurred to me that I was living a real life there. In my imagination, I was always there for just another few months, just until Christmas or Easter or the first warm day in May. For that reason, I was most comfortable in the company of Southerners. They seemed to be in New York as I was, on some indefinitely extended leave from wherever they belonged, disinclined to consider the future, temporary exiles who always knew when the flights left for New Orleans or Memphis or Richmond or, in my case, California. Someone who lives always with a plain schedule in the drawer lives on a slightly different calendar. Christmas, for example, was a difficult season. Other people could take it in stride, going to Stowe or going abroad or going for the day to their mother's places in Connecticut. Those of us who believed that we lived somewhere else would spend it making and canceling airline reservations, waiting for weather-bound flights as if for the last plane out of Lisbon in 1940, and finally comforting one another, those of us who were left, with the oranges and mementos and smoked oyster stuffings of childhood gathering close, colonials in a far country, which is precisely what we were. I am not sure that it is possible for anyone brought up in the East to appreciate entirely what New York, the idea of New York, means to those of us who came out of the West and the South. To an Eastern child, particularly a child who has always had an uncle on Wall Street and who has spent several hundred Saturdays first at FAO Schwartz and being fitted for shoes at Best's and then waiting under the Biltmore clock and dancing to Lester Landon, New York is just a city, albeit the city, a plausible place for people to live. But to those of us who came from places where no one had heard of Lester Landon and Grand Central Station was a Saturday radio program, where Wall Street and Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue were not places at all but abstractions, money and high fashion and the hucksters, New York was no mere city. It was instead an infinitely romantic notion, the mysterious nexus of all love and money and power, the shining and perishable dream itself. To think of living there was to reduce the miraculous to the mundane. One does not live at Xanadu. And I would add to that the Italian mob movies and the Jewish Woody Allen movies. I would add to that the mobsters and the spaghetti. I would add to that Martin Scorsese and Dizzy Gillespie. New York City, and in many cases New York State, for those of us who came out of the West and the South, will always be an abstraction, not a place you're actually from. It is hard for those raised in areas where people in relationships tower over geography and place. It is hard for them to understand that those raised in places of geography will never put people above relationships, and vice versa. It's hard. Leaders know that people, places, geography, and relationships are all intertwined. They do their level best to understand and listen to what people who are following them say, as well as watch what those people insist on doing. But leaders are people as well, trapped by feet of clay, right? In the gossamer of relationships ruled by involuble layers and impenetrable levels, and, of course, as Didion would probably say, unsayable or untellable stories. The savvy, insightful, self-aware leader leverages the tool of the memoir written to him or herself to flesh out understanding, work through frustration, get clarity in thought, and to find the candor in situations of leadership where verbal courage may fail. The savvy, insightful, and intentional leader understands that leadership without fundamentals, like those that Didion described as being frayed at the edges and slouching towards Bethlehem, those fundamentals, leadership without that is just posing in an empty suit, building on a pyramid of shifting sand, and leaders who realize this refuse to play the shifting sands game. The savvy leader performs the fundamental acts for their own center, those acts of journaling, reflecting, and actively listening to themselves before getting into the game of navigating geography or the people or the places or the relationships that intentional leadership inevitably requires. But the fundamentals have to be sound first. Didion passed away in 2021, December of 2021, at the age of 87, from complications due to Parkinson's disease that gave her trembles and made her shake her hands around. Parkinson's disease is a terrible disease. I personally know people who have been impacted by it, and if you want to watch a great documentary about Didion, where she also reads from Slouching Towards Bethlehem as well as After Henry in Miami, and talks a little bit about her books Play It As It Lays and a few other of her novels that are floating around out there in the world. If you want to watch a great documentary about this, watch it on Netflix. It's called The Center Will Not Hold. Again, pulling from the W.B. Yeats poem where the title of Slouching Towards Bethlehem came from. She was predeceased by her daughter Quintana in a tragic death from, I believe, pneumonia in 2005, or it might have been 2003. You can email me and correct me on that. But she's predeceased by her daughter Quintana and her husband, the writer John Gregory Dunn, who she was married to for quite some time, a number of years, I believe close to 30 years. She was married to John Gregory Dunn, and had a full life with him. By the way, John Gregory Dunn is also I believe the brother, if I remember correctly, of Dominic Dunn, which, if you remember the 1990s the way I do, you remember that Dominic Dunn wrote a bunch of true crime novels and somehow was tangentially involved in the O.J. Simpson trial. So I'll just leave that for whatever it's worth. Anyway, what would Didion have to say if we could talk to her about staying on the path of leadership, right? Staying on the path of intentional leadership and walking that path intentionally with a heightened sense of self-awareness. Well, I think if we had an opportunity to talk with her, I think she'd probably say that you can't actually become self-aware, that it's all self-deception, and you're lying to yourself if you believe you could even get there. Okay. She would probably also say that her memoirs and her essays are poor examples to be used if you want to get to truth about yourself. But I would disagree. I would disagree with that assertion. I think there's 3 ways to stay on the path, and Didion does give us an example. And maybe you can take it as a negative one, but she does give us an example of how to do that effectively. I think that the first thing that leaders have to understand is that leadership is hard enough without knowing yourself well enough to critique yourself. You have to be willing to open the door and stare inside. You have to be able to see inside of yourself and be willing to do the hard work of sitting with yourself. Again, not in a navel-gazing sense, but more with a sense of, how am I going to grow from this? Leaders have to do that. Leaders in family, leaders in community, leaders in nation states, and the less we see of that in families, in communities, in neighborhoods, and in nation states, the more dysfunction and ego-driven behavior you tend to get. I think the other thing that we can note from Didion's work is that leadership is sometimes fool's gold, but that should never be confused with a gold rush. There's the genuine article, there's the real thing, and there's the thing that's bona fide, as a Southerner would say, but then there's the thing that's just fake. It's just pretend. It ain't bona fide. And there's a lot of ain't bona fide leadership floating around. There's a lot of people who have positions in leadership. They have the title of leader, but they haven't done the self-awareness work. They haven't done the hard work of being intentional. They just haven't done the work. They haven't put in the time. And maybe they should be listening to this podcast. Maybe you should recommend it to them. I think the other thing that Didion might note, and I think she would actually agree with us about this, and I've been asserting this for many years, I think she would agree that leadership is hard without a compass, whether that compass is moral or geographical or relational or people-driven or place-driven or whatever. You have to have a compass of some type, and you have to be clear about what your compass actually is. And, by the way, you have to have enough clarity to explain your compass to other people. I think she would agree with that. Leadership without self-awareness is hard. Leadership without the willingness to commit to the hard work, commit to the consistency that self-awareness work requires in order to become more self-aware, in order to be more turned on internally so that you can make better decisions externally. Leadership without that is not leadership at all. It's just you standing in a position with a bunch of people following you around. I think Didion would agree with that. I would encourage you to pick up her books of essays after Henry, of course, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, and the White Album. You can get them everywhere you get books. And read memoirs from writers you like. Read nonfiction essays from writers you like, and read them very closely. Read them not to find out who the writer is and not to find out what the truth of the particular situation is that they are explaining, but read them as examples of what you can do in your own leadership life. How you can journal, not for anyone else's consumption. How you can reflect, not to help anyone else, although it will help other people, but to begin to help yourself stay intentionally on the very long and very hard leadership path that has been laid out before you. And well, that's it for me. Listen and subscribe to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast on all the major podcast players that you listen to, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and of course, Spotify. And leave a 5-star review if you like the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Look, we need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way that you can help us actually grow this show. And of course, tell all your friends. If you want to get started down the leadership path, our products from HSCT Publishing can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, our coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. And check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. We've got books that will help you and your team grow. So pick up a copy today of My Boss Doesn't Care, 100 Essays on Disrupting Your Workplace by Disrupting Your Boss. And subscribe to the Little Red podcast we launched earlier this year with the same name as this Little Red book. My Boss Doesn't Care, 100 Essays on Disrupting Your Workplace by Disrupting Your Boss. And of course, pick up my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation of Intentional Leadership, written with Bradley Madigan. You're going to want to pick up a copy of that in April 2022. And you can get both of these books in paperback, hardcover, or as ebooks on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books on demand. Finally, we are on YouTube, or I'm on YouTube, or someone around here is on YouTube. So like and subscribe to the video version of the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing on YouTube and hit the subscribe button to get updates every single time we upload a new video, which we do that at least once a week. And subscribe to the Jesan Sorrells Presents Audio Experience podcast. Yes, I have 3 podcasts on YouTube where I talk more casually with a wider range of people about all matters that matter in the world today. Everything from fatherhood to criminal justice, Christianity to artificial intelligence. We cover the entire plethora of things that are floating around in my mind, and that's why it's called an audio experience. All right, well, that's it for me. Out.